Sharon. Next up then is Steve McCaffery. Steve is born in 1947 in Sheffield. Steve McCaffery is the author of around 40 books, chapbooks of poetry, as well as 5 critical books, the most recent of which is The Darkness of the Present, Vortex, Anachronism and the Anomaly. He is David Gray Chair Endowed Professor of Poetry and Letters at the State University of New York. Steve again is another very important figure in the international poetry world. One of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as I keep saying, but he's not actually manifesting Essence play or anything else. But a very important sound and visual and lexical poet. So again, another great pleasure to have Steve here. And Steve will be reading later as well, so more about that later. Steve McCaffery.
This, what I'm about to read you, is rather odd, and there's a strange, persisting irony in it, because in many ways what I'm arguing is against what I've argued for the rest of my creative life. It's not really, what I'm going to do, it's not a paper, but more like a consummation of 10 other papers that I was given on different occasions in different places at different conferences that actually came out in that book that Steve mentioned, The Darkness of the Present. That I didn't read copies along because they're enormously heavy, and books normally don't sell at poetry festivals, I've found. So. But what I will read then is the introduction, which is a part of the introduction from it, on linearity, anomaly, and anachronism. Karen mentioned Alexander Nagel, and I came to Nagel's 2 books, Anachronic Renaissance and Medieval Modern. Actually, after this work had been finished, I gave a talk at NYU, and Nagel teaches that. But what the book tries to do is really problematize the ability, or really complicate what it is to claim something to be innovative today or new. And that's why I'm going against myself, because I've all my creative life I pledged, Confucius, yes, make it new. Baudelaire, it has to be modern, and William Carlos Williams, it's not beautiful unless it is new. So that binding moniker through modernism is something that becomes empirically questioned within this. And what I saw myself working towards when I brought the essays together was really a notion of palindromic time, which is obviously it's a poetic concept and not a scientific one. But the work itself is very much in the spirit of Nagel, in seeing time topographically rather than in any kind of linear succession. So let me read a little bit from the introduction at Benefits. So I'll start in medias res. Okay. These essays are linked, however, by a common preoccupation reflected in the title of the book. In many ways, the chapters underscore the interlacement, even perplication of an odyssey of 2 well-known abused and disabused concepts, the anomaly and the anachronism, and the way their empirical emergence works to unsettle a steady notion of the contemporary or the new. I judge my attempts in this regard against the backdrop of one of Jerome McGann's arresting apothegms. Quote, out of scholarship comes the advancement of learning, out of criticism, its arrest. The turbulation of the past, in order to arouse the imp of anachronism, is a critical appropriation of the scholarly, and results at times in juxtapositions that might seem mobilized along Reverdy's theory of the image, a chance convergence of vastly distant periods and proclivities. Hopefully, however, the studies in this book contribute towards a genuine poeticology of the anomaly and the anachronism, and in so doing engage the past and the present as both metaleptic and chiasmic, by which the contemporary is historicized at the same time as the historical finds itself contemporized. Collectively, the book challenges the validity of historic models of supersession and offers a variety of investigations into undeclared and even uncanny affiliations. It also strives to present historical articulations that disconcert the urge to literary periodization and disciplinary partition. In many ways, the book was written in awareness of Derrida's caveat against periodization. Quote, the posts and posters which proliferate today, post-structuralism, post-modernism, etc., still surrender to the historicist urge. Everything marks an era, even the decentering of the subject, post-humanism. It is as if one again wished to put a linear succession in order, to periodize, to distinguish before and after, to limit the risks of reversibility or repetition, transformation or permutation, an ideology of progress. And that's from an essay by Derrida, an architectural essay, Point de Folie. Derrida's statement is in broad concurrence with Bergson's own emphatic rejection of the linear nature of time and its supporting logic of succession. For Bergson, the present and the past are coexistent. When McGann envisages a historical model that proposes a past that has not yet happened, I activate a model along Bergsonian and Derridian lines in which a past leaps into the now. In its investment in bringing to light unexplored connections, the book also situates the radical geophilosophy that Deleuze and Guattari outlined in 1,000 Plateaus. Friedrich Schlegel famously declared that all self-sufficiency is radical, is original. Without originality, there is no energy of reason and no beauty of disposition. The darkness of the present questions this intimate connection of originality and autonomy by calling up the necessary insistence of the unacknowledged precedent and the already belated new. The new is always a milieu of multiplicities, where echo sometimes meets a magnet that pulls heterogenesis to the past or propels the past forward. In the process, this book repositions certain texts in genealogies different from those to which they are traditionally and customarily assigned. As well as broadening ancestral series, the book aims to invoke historical rumblings whose sediments collectively work to muddy the clarity of the notion of contemporary in a chronological manner recently articulated by Giorgio Agamben for what is the contemporary, if not, to quote Agamben, that relationship with time that adheres to it through a disjunction and an anachronism. And that's from Agamben's Nudities. This sentiment, however, is not dissimilar to Charles Olson's bold claim that the work, the real work of the future, has already been done. And that's from Olson's A Lecture at Goddard College. Or Lyotard's tenet that every occurrence is a recurrence, not at all in the sense that it could repeat the same thing or be the rehearsal of the same play, but in the sense of the Freudian nachträglich, the way the first offence touches our mind too soon and the second too late, so that the first time is like a thought not yet thought, while the second is like a not thought to be thought later. Whereas Shakespeare famously has Brutus hear a clock strike, the anachronisms I present frequently remark the return of the repressed, the forgotten and the unacknowledged, of what Agamben calls the darkness of the present, a phrase I have adapted in my title. It marks the volatility of origin, famously noted by both Heidegger and Foucault. Phrased differently, the judgment of a text as being innovative is inevitably confronted by the fact of the anachronic. Indeed, to elucidate an anachronism is to reimagine a historic momentum that is quantum in its trajectory. As a result, this book seeks to offer fresh perspectives on the contemporary as a condition that is partly reiterative and partly refractive. No anxieties of influence are argued, nor any revisionary ratios proposed, but rather the focus is the surprising appearance of predecessors, of a text before a text, sufficient to complicate the notions of contemporary and innovation. At its most rhetorical, this book contributes to what might be called an archaeology of the new, insisting on an absolute chiasmic dynamic to both categories present and past. Figured more playfully, it can be regarded as assembled positions arrived at by treating time not as unidirectional but as palindromic. This rescues time from theology, physics, and metaphysics alike to locate it in the literary and the tropic. I hope further that this book rises to McGann's challenge to change it, the archive, our thinking about the archive. And I will select from a few of the chapters. Two fairly long ones are based on architecture and look at the labyrinth as that was developed in Constance New Babylon, the situationist unitary urbanism, and also Ginza Narakawa's multiple labyrinths. But I will select the summaries of some of the chapters. The first chapter examines the emergence of the Dada sound poem in 1916 as a generic anomaly, a veritable poetry without words that jettisons one of the hitherto indispensable elements of poetic composition, meaning. Drawing heavily upon the diaries of Hugo Ball, the sound poem's self-proclaimed inventor, the chapter examines the sound poem's two telic intensitives, the mantic and the individual, and suggests that it seems correct to interpret the sound poem as an extreme form of lyric expressionism. Considered as such, the sound poem offers proleptically one answer to Alain Badiou's question to the French intellectual Jean Boré: how can we adapt speech to a series of disasters? Detailed examination of the sound poem's ephemeral history, however, reveals that it invests not in the sonic and non-semantic per se, but rather offers a radical theory of the poetic image as a collective mnemonic provocation that Ball himself names the grammalogue. In this respect, the sound poem can be fruitfully compared to Pound's theories of the imagist and vorticist images that dates from the same decade. Ball's innovation is further undermined when measured against Mallarmé's own project of the essential word, whose bias towards connotation gains its intimate comparison with Ball's grammalogue. Additionally, the chapter puts forth some of the psychophysiological theories of Ball's age, Lombroso's, Voringer's, and Wundt's, which demonstrate that Ball's psychoanthropological interests and Dada's general fascination with irrationality and insanity should be seen as less anomalous than commonly thought of and simply typical of the period. In chapter 2, I look at Ronald Johnson's Radios. Do people know that work? It's described here. Radios as an exemplary postmodern text of deletion. This is the way it's referred to. It's the realization of a corrosive poetics, as I call it. Radios is a treated text, a poem exhumed from a different poem, Milton's Paradise Lost, whose twin inspirations Johnson claims were the structured inaudibility of Lucas Foss's Baroque Variations No. 1 and William Blake's infernal method of relief etching. The chapter argues for a connection that traces Radios well beyond the postmodern and Blake's compositional method to the poetic advance in Geoffrey of Vansov's Poetria Nova, an early 13th century treatise that inflects a chronological, distant notion of the modern. This second also introduces a discussion of transsumption and metalepsis that can be seen as synecdochal to the book's entire thematic orientation, an attempt to render problematic the precise notion of the contemporary by adopting a metaleptic approach to linear sequential history. In discussing Johnson's deletional method of composition, I introduce a theme of negative creation that is developed in the succeeding two chapters from variant interpretational perspectives. The bulk of chapter 6 discusses an inverted and more extreme form of negative poetics. It is Kenneth Goldsmith's anomalous practice of uncreative writing. In his 2003 project Day, a verbatim transcription of all words, numbers and characters in a single issue of the New York Times, Goldsmith not only resuscitates the old scribal practice of the Middle Ages, but also radically challenges the validity of any creative composition in the current ethos of information and creative overload. Conceptual writing of this kind both abnegates the creative production of texts and licenses the modality of boredom and the banality of transcription as it ushers in the epoch of the post-readerly text and the transformation of a readership into a thinkership. And the post-readerly is Goldsmith's term, not mine. The chapter also discusses precedents to many of Goldsmith's conceptual projects, but remains mindful of the fact that Goldsmith has never claimed his work to be original, a confession that led Marjorie Perloff to the concept of unoriginal genius. I do not consider Goldsmith's conscious appropriations, especially of Andy Warhol's work, but rather focus on less familiar resuscitations, unknown to Goldsmith himself, such as the unpublished diaries of Robert Shields and Tobias Smollett's fastidious noting of a year's weather in Naples. Robert Shields, incidentally, kept a diary for 45 years in which he made an entry every 15 minutes describing the shape of his feces after he'd taken bowel movements and enumerating the sheets of toilet paper he actually used. And, these were actually all donated to Ohio State University in 900 boxes that I'm sure billions of graduate students will be rushing to read. But just an amazing document. What I argue is, if Goldsmith is considered a conceptual writer, why doesn't people even talk about Robert Shields? That puts it this. I will finish actually by talking about two chapters here. There's one, which is the main. Chapter 9 considers some of Clark Coolidge's early poetry, found in his 1970 book, Space. Rather than regard these poems as either influenced by American abstract expressionism or prescient of the disjunctive, hypertactic compositions of language poetry, the chapter demonstrates their cogent, anachronistic appropriation of the 18th century aesthetic theory of the picturesque. Indeed, the chapter renders the latter as a present investment, to use Charles Bernstein's term, and in doing so moves to habilitate Nate Mackey's critical efforts to break out of predetermined cultural categories through purposeful readings across the African-American and Euro-American avant-gardes, aimed at reaching a broader historical horizon. But where Mackey seeks creative kinships and affinities across ethnic and regional boundaries, I offer a transhistoric reading across 3 centuries. The picturesque partook of its new through a radical capture of the dominant aesthetic doublet of the beautiful and the sublime, as well as through its theory of variety, the detail, as outlined by William Gilpin and Uverdale Price. It opens up a horizon to envision a poetics of the rough and irregular. The chapter moves on to present this new poetics of the irregular that inflects the condition of infancy, an inflection that equally summarizes the vanguard trajectories of the 20th and 21st centuries. To wish infancy and to desire a recovery to a state outside of adult parlance, a state before language, is less the exception than the norm in many 20th century texts. Chapter 10, and I'll finish with this. Chapter 10, though relatively short, offers the radical axis of the entire book. The Pataphysics of Auschwitz explores Alfred Jarry's science of pataphysics, which was conceived amidst the hilarities of the banquet years as a science of imaginary solutions that governs the rules and laws of the exception rather than the norm. After a panoramic parade of unrecognized pataphysicians and a brief consideration of pataphysics as a potential weapon against metaphysics, the chapter picks up the tenor that concluded chapter 8 by examining the implications of pataphysics in the light of the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt's theory of sovereignty. A disturbing affinity is proposed between Jarry's science and the Nazi justification for the final solution, endorsed on January the 20th, 1942, at Wannsee, converting an imaginary science into a final solution. Nazi ideology, in part, is shown to be pataphysical in its preoccupation with the state of the exception. The chapter concludes interrogatively: how to engage this conjunction in a way other than non-causally. And that was a strange... I wrote that paper actually to present in Philadelphia some years ago, but when I was reading Carl Schmitt, his theories of novelty were exactly the claims that Jarry is making within his theory of pataphysics. So that kind of gives a drift of where it's going to make me think, give a sense of why it moves towards problematizing the news. And I have absolutely no idea what my next book will be after this. Hopefully something entirely